The law book felt heavy in Thorgils the Law Speaker's hands. It was not paper but vellum, calfskin, scraped and treated, filled with the careful runes that held their world together. The year was around 900, maybe a decade or two later, here at the Gulating, the Great Assembly for Western Norway. The air smelled of damp wool, wood smoke, and the sea, and a man named Ketil stood before the assembly, for he was not a Jarl or a great farmer. For 30 years, he had been a thrall, a slave. His master, an old man named Orm, had decided to free him. A good deed, a Christian deed, some of the newer thinkers might say. Orm was just old and had no sons to leave Kettle to. The process was clear in the Gulating law. Orm led Ketil to the assembly. He took Ketil by the hand and presented him to 6 witnesses, all free men, all landowners. He declared his intent. I, Orm, son of Hrolf, grant this man Ketil his freedom. He is no longer my thrall. Then came the part that mattered. Orm had to pay a sum, the freedom price, to the community. It was 3 marks of silver. It's a significant amount, about the price of 12 milk cows. This payment showed that Ketil was no longer just property, but a person with a place in society. He was now a Leysingi, a freedman. But as Ketil stood there, breathing the air of a free man for the first time, he knew the truth. His freedom was a new kind of chain. The law was specific. A Leysingi still owed things to his former master. He owed loyalty. He owed a portion of his work. If Orm demanded it, he could not move from the land without Orm's permission. If Ketil died without children, his property, what little he might gather, would not go to a distant cousin or a friend. It would go back to Orm or Orm's family. His social status was a pale shadow of a true free-born farmer. He could not act as a high-ranking witness in a legal case. His word was not as heavy. And the price on his own life, his wargild, was exactly half that of the poorest freeborn man. Ketil was free, yes. The law said so. But he was not equal. He had simply taken one step up a very long, very steep ladder, and the rung he stood on was still slippery. Number 25. The foundation of society was not freedom. The Unen was born on a farm overlooking a fjord near modern-day Bergen. The year was 860. She never knew her parents. Her mother was a thrall from Ireland, captured in a raid. Her father was likely the farm owner, a man named Hakon, or one of his sons. It did not matter. Was born a thrall, and that was her world. Her name, was simple, a name for a thrall. It meant wave or tow love, but for her it just meant her. There were no grand family names or stories attached to it. Her life was a cycle of tasks dictated by the sun and the seasons. In the summer, she worked in the fields, bent over, cutting hay with a small iron sickle until her back ached. She milked the cows, her hands chapped and sore. She carried water from the stream in heavy wooden buckets. In the winter, she worked inside the longhouse. The air was thick with smoke from the central fire pit. Her eyes burned. She spun wool into thread on a drop spindle, a constant, repetitive motion. She ground grain between 2 heavy stones, turning the handle for hours until her shoulders screamed. She did not own the clothes she wore, a simple, rough woolen tunic. She did not own the wooden bowl she ate from. She did not own her body. Hakon, the master, was a hard man. He did not beat his thralls without reason, but the reasons were his to decide. Spilling milk could earn a cuff. A slow response could earn a kick. Saw another thrall, a man named Finn, beaten for breaking an axe handle. It was not the man's health Hakon cared about. It was the cost of the axe. A thrall was property, like a cow or a goat. If a thrall was injured or killed by an outsider, the compensation, the wargild, was paid to the owner, not the thrall's family. Because a thrall had no legal family, unslept on a straw pallet in a small, windowless shed with the other thralls. They were a mixed group. Some, like her, were born into it. Others were captured. There was a woman from England who spoke a strange tongue and wept silently at night. There was a man from the east, a Finn who knew things about the forest but was clumsy with a fishing net. They had no rights. A thrall could not own land. A thrall could not testify at the local assembly. A thrall could not marry in any legal sense. Any children she had would belong to her master. This was the base of the Viking social ladder. The entire structure, the wealth of the farmers, the power of the Jarls, was built on the unfree labor of people like Un. They were the silent, invisible foundation. They made the swords the warriors used, grew the food the raiders ate, and wove the sails that carried the longships across the sea. Their lack of freedom was the price for everyone else's. Number 24, you could not simply choose to be free. Tostig was a farmer, a carl, in the Danish region of Jutland around the year 950. He was not a thrall. He was born free, but his freedom was a fragile thing, tied directly to the land his family had worked for generations. One year, the harvest was poor. A sickness took 2 of his best milk cows. A raid by Norwegian Vikings burned his neighbor's farm, and Tostig feared he was next. He was in debt to a local chieftain, a man named Sven. The debt was for seed grain from 2 seasons ago. Tostig had few options. He could not just pack up and leave. His identity was tied to his community. To leave was to become a nobody, a wanderer without protection. He could try to fight his way out of his problems, but he was one man with a family to feed. So he went to Sven. He offered to work off the debt. Sven agreed, but the terms were harsh. Tostig would have to work Sven's fields 3 days a week, and he would have to give Sven a larger portion of his own harvest. The arrangement was meant to last until the debt was paid, but with interest and the demands on his time, Tostig fell further behind. This was a common path into a form of bondage. While not technically a thrall, Tostig was no longer truly free. He was a debtor bound to another man. In some cases, a desperate man could sell himself into thraldom for a set period of years to feed his family. It was a last resort, a choice made when all other choices had disappeared. Freedom was not an abstract concept, it was economic independence. Without it, a person's status crumbled. Another way a free person could lose their freedom was through legal punishment. The law codes were clear. If a man was found guilty of a crime like theft and could not pay the fine, he could be made a thrall to the person he had wronged. His property would be forfeit, his family disgraced. This was a powerful tool for social control. It meant that a legal dispute was not just about money, it could be about a person's entire existence. One bad decision, one lost lawsuit could plunge a free family into slavery. This constant threat kept people in line. It reinforced the idea that freedom was not a right, but a status that had to be maintained through hard work, good fortune, and careful observance of the law. Free freedom was not a given. It could be lost. Number 23. Your value was a specific number. In the year 1014, a dispute arose in Iceland. At the Althing, the great annual assembly, 2 men stood before the law speaker. One was named Thorstein, a farmer with a medium-sized holding. The other was Kolbein, the son of a local chieftain. The issue was simple. During a horse fight, a popular sport, Kolbein's stallion had savaged Thorstein's prize mare, a horse essential for his farm work. The mare had to be killed. Thorstein demanded compensation. The law speaker, Snorri, a man respected for his memory of the laws, listened to both sides. The case was not about the horse, it was about the men. The law of Iceland, like other Norse law codes, was built on the concept of wergild, or man prices. Every person had a specific monetary value assigned to them based on their social rank. This value determined the fines for injuring or killing them. It was a way to prevent endless blood feuds by replacing vengeance with payment. A powerful chieftain, a goatee like Kolbein's father, had a very high wergild. It might be 200 marks of silver, a standard free farmer. A bondi like Thorstein had a wergild of 100 marks. A freedman, a Leysingi, was worth half that. And a thrall? A thrall's wergild was low, perhaps only 8 marks, and it was paid to his owner, not his family. This system made the social hierarchy brutally clear. Some lives were legally worth more than others. In the case of the horse, the compensation was also tied to social status, because Kolbein was of a higher rank, his word carried more weight. His witnesses were more credible, but Thorstein was a stubborn man. He argued his case well. The final judgment was a compromise. Kolbein had to pay for the horse, but the amount was less than Thorstein had asked for. It was a small victory for Thorstein, but it highlighted the reality of their society. Justice was not blind, it saw rank, it saw status, and it calculated everything in silver. This system of specific values extended to everything. An insult had a price. A lost finger had a price. A burned down house had a price. Society was a complex ledger of debts and payments, all calculated according to your rung on the ladder. Number 22. Freedom gained was not freedom earned. In Katil, the Lesingi, freed by his master Orm near the Gulating, found life more complicated than he had imagined. It was the year 910, a few years after his freedom ceremony. He had been allowed to build a small hut on the edge of Orm's property. He had even married a woman, a thrall from the same farm, who Orm had also freed. They had a son. But Katil's new status was a constant reminder of his past. When he went to the local market to trade a few chickens he had raised, the other farmers looked at him differently. He was not one of them. He was Kettle the Freedman. His accent, his mannerisms, the way he deferred to others, all marked him as former property. He was invited to feasts, but he was seated at the far end of the hall, away from the important men. His opinion was not sought. The most difficult part was the law. A dispute arose with a free-born neighbor over a boundary line between their small plots. The neighbor claimed a strip of Kettle's cabbage patch. They took the matter to the local thing. Kettle tried to speak for himself. But the law stated that a Lesingi's testimony in a land dispute against a free-born man was not valid on its own. He needed a free-born man to speak for him, to vouch for his claim. He had to go to his old master Orm and ask him for help. Orm, feeling a sense of obligation, spoke for Kettle, and the matter was settled in Kettle's favor. But the victory felt hollow. It was not his victory, it was Orm's. His son Bjarni would face an even stranger situation. According to the Gulating law, the child of a freedman was not fully free either. He was considered a second-generation freedman. His warguild was higher than his father's, but still lower than that of a man born to two free parents. Full legal status, equal to a Carl, would only come to Ketel's grandson, assuming he was born of free parents. It was a three-generation climb out of the pit of thraldom. Freedom was not a gift that could be given in a single moment. It was a debt to the past that had to be paid off over decades. Kettle had been given a new legal name, but he could not erase the invisible mark of the thrall. Number 21A, craftsman's skill, was a different kind of land. And Styrbjorn was a smith. He lived in the trading town of Birka in what is now Sweden around the year 850. He did not own vast tracts of farmland like a chieftain. He owned a small plot of land with a smoky workshop on it. His wealth was not in cattle or grain. It was in his hands and his knowledge of fire and iron. Styrbjorn was a Carl, a freeman, but his place in the social order was unique. He was not a farmer, a bondi who formed the backbone of rural society. He was a specialist. Farmers needed him for plowshares, for axes, for knives. Their warriors needed him for spearheads, for shield bosses, for swords. A good smith was essential to the community. This gave him a level of respect and independence that other landless men did not have. A powerful Jarl might be his patron, but Styrbjorn was not his servant. The Jarl needed Styrbjorn's skills as much as Styrbjorn needed the Jarl's silver. One day, the Jarl's finest warrior came to his workshop. The warrior's sword, a prized weapon from the Frankish lands, had a nick in the blade. The warrior was arrogant. He treated Styrbjorn like a servant. Styrbjorn took the sword. He looked at the steel, at the complex pattern welding. He knew its secrets. He told the warrior the repair would take time and would be expensive. The warrior balked at the price. Styrbjorn just shrugged and handed the sword back. "Then find another smith," he said. There was no other smith in Birka who could do the work properly. The warrior, after some grumbling, agreed to the price. Styrbjorn's status was not defined by the thing or by his Wyrgild alone. It was defined by his craft. He was part of a growing class of artisans and tradesmen in the new towns like Birka, Hedeby, and Kaupang. There were woodcarvers, boat builders, comb makers, and jewelers. They were a new element in the social structure. They did not fit neatly into the farmer-warrior mold. Their position showed that Viking society was not static. It was changing. As trade grew, a man's worth was not just measured in acres, but also in the skill of his hands. Styrbjorn, hammering a piece of glowing iron into the shape of a sword, was forging his own place in the world, one that was respected and necessary. Number 20, a merchant's wealth was not noble. Bjorn was a merchant from Gotland, an island in the Baltic Sea. The year was 920. He was a wealthy man. His house was large and filled with goods from faraway lands. He had silver from the Caliphate in Baghdad, glass beads from Francia, and fine wool from England. But when he attended the local thing, the landed chieftains, the Jarls, looked down on him. Bjorn's wealth was new, and it came from trade, not from land inherited through generations. In the Viking mindset, true wealth was land. Land was permanent. It was tied to family, to ancestors, to honor. A Jarl's power came from the farms he owned and the loyalty of the farmers who lived on them. This was old, honorable wealth. Bjorn's wealth was different. It was fluid, portable. It was silver coins and trade goods. He earned it not by fighting or farming, but by haggling in distant markets. To the warrior aristocracy, this was not entirely respectable. It was work for lesser men. Bjorn undertook a long and dangerous journey. He sailed south along the rivers of the Rus, through lands of hostile tribes, to the great city of Constantinople. He traded his northern furs and amber for silk and spices. The journey took over a year. He faced storms, rapids, and bandits. 3 of his men died, but he returned with a fortune. He used his new wealth to buy more land on Gotland. He sponsored a lavish feast for the local Jarl, giving him a beautiful Byzantine silk cloak and a silver inlaid sword. This was his strategy. He was converting his trade wealth into the symbols of traditional status. He was buying land, the source of noble power. He was engaging in gift-giving, the key to a chieftain's influence. He was trying to buy his way into the aristocracy. His sons would not be known as the sons of a merchant. They would be landowners. They would have the respect that he, for all his silver, could never fully command. The existence of men like Bjorn shows a tension in Viking society. The old order, based on land and lineage, was being challenged by the new wealth generated by raiding and trade. A man could become rich through commerce, but to turn that wealth into true social power, he had to play by the old rules of land ownership and noble display. Number 19, your word could make or break a king. Gunnar was a skald, a poet. He served in the court of a Norwegian jarl named Einar around the year 900. Gunnar was not a warrior. He was often slight of build and not skilled with an axe. He did not own land. Yet in the Longhouse, during the winter feasts, all eyes were on him. When the Jarl called for a poem, silence fell. Gunnar's power was in his words. A skald was a highly respected professional. Their craft was complex. Skaldic poetry was not simple rhyming. It had a strict, intricate structure of meter, internal rhyme, and alliteration. He also relied on kennings, which were metaphorical compound phrases like wound do for blood or compound phrase. To compose such a poem on the spot, celebrating a victory or praising a lord's generosity, required immense skill and a quick mind. A good poem was a gift, as valuable as a sword or an arm ring. It was a payment for a lord's patronage. More importantly, it was permanent. A skald's poem was the only way a chieftain's deeds would be remembered. In a society without widespread writing, oral poetry was history. A skald could ensure a Jarl's name would live on for generations. And he could create a legacy. This gave the skald enormous influence. A Jarl needed a good skald to cement his reputation. But this power had a dark side. Just as a skald could praise, he could also mock. A poem of insult called a nid was a terrible weapon. It could accuse a man of cowardice or other shameful traits. Such an accusation, put into a catchy, memorable verse, could destroy a man's honor and social standing. It was considered so potent that in some law codes, composing a nid was a crime punishable by outlawry or death. One evening, Jarl Einar gave Gunnar a fine gold ring for a poem praising his recent raid, but a rival warrior, jealous of the poet's influence, sneered that Gunnar's words were cheap. Gunnar did not draw a weapon. He simply looked at the warrior and began to compose a short, sharp verse. He hinted at the warrior's greed and his supposed failure in a past battle. The verse was clever and cutting. The other men in the hall chuckled. The warrior's face turned red. He had been shamed not by a sword, but by a handful of words. Gunnar had proven his point. In the Viking world, the tongue could be as mighty as the sword arm. A skald's position on the social ladder was unique, floating somewhere between a craftsman and a noble advisor, respected and feared in equal measure. Number 18, the law was not a book, but a man. In the summer of 930, men from all over Iceland gathered at a place called Thingvellir, the Assembly Plains. This was the first meeting of the Althing, the national parliament of Iceland. There were no kings in Iceland, only a collection of chieftains and farmers. To govern themselves, they needed a system, they needed law, but their law was not written down in a book for everyone to read. The law was held in the memory of one man, the law speaker, the Lagsogamadur. The first law speaker was a man named Uffeljotur. He had reportedly spent 3 years in Norway studying its laws before bringing them back to Iceland. His job was one of the most important in the new Commonwealth. For the next 3 summers, it would be his duty to stand at the Law Rock, the Logberg, and recite 1/3 of the entire legal code from memory. Over his 3-year term, the entire body of law would be spoken aloud, ensuring it was not forgotten. The law speaker's role was not just recitation, he was the ultimate legal authority. When a dispute arose and the law was unclear, the chieftains would consult him. His interpretation was final. He presided over the assembly, opened the proceedings, and announced the session was closed. He had immense power, but it was a power based on knowledge, not on wealth or military might. He was elected by the chieftains and was expected to be impartial. He was paid for his services, a fixed amount from the assembly, to ensure he was not easily bribed. Imagine the scene. A farmer named Gudmund has a dispute with his neighbor. He travels for 2 weeks to reach the Althing. He presents his case to his local chieftain, who then brings it before the assembly court. An argument ensues. The law is complex. Finally, they turn to the law speaker. He stands, clears his throat, and begins to speak, reciting the exact passage from the inheritance laws that applies to the case. His voice carries over the crowd. His word settles the matter. The law has spoken not from a page, but from a person. The law speaker was the living embodiment of the social contract. He was a pillar of their society, a man whose place on the ladder was secured not by the strength of his arm, but by the strength of his memory. Number 17, a woman's power was in her keys. Astrid was the wife of a Jarl named Olaf. They lived in a large longhouse on the coast of Norway in the late 9th century. Olaf was a powerful man, often away for months at a time on trading voyages or raids. When he was gone, the running of the entire estate, a community of perhaps 100 people, including family, farmhands, and thralls, fell to Astrid. She was the Husfreyja, the lady of the house. Her status was not merely symbolic, it was made visible by the keys she wore hanging from a chain or brooch on her dress. These were not just keys to doors, they were the keys to the food stores, the chests of valuables, the locked cupboards where the fine linens and imported goods were kept. These keys gave her absolute authority within the household, the Innegard's world. While her husband commanded the world outside, the Utingards, she commanded the world within. No one, not even her eldest son, could take food from the stores without her permission. Her responsibilities were immense. She had to manage the food supply, ensuring there was enough to last through the long, dark winter. She supervised the thralls in their work weaving cloth, preserving fish and meat, brewing ale, and making cheese. She was also a healer with knowledge of herbs and remedies for sickness and injury. She was the chief financial officer of the estate, managing its resources and ensuring its prosperity. When visitors arrived, it was Astrid who welcomed them and offered them hospitality. The quality of the food and ale she served reflected on the honor of the entire family. If a dispute arose among the household staff, it was her job to resolve it. Her authority was backed by law and custom. The sagas tell stories of forceful women who ran their households with an iron will, respected and sometimes feared by all. There was a clear division of labor, but it was not a division into important and unimportant work. The success of the entire enterprise depended on both the man's and the woman's spheres. A Jarl could bring back immense wealth from a raid, but if his wife was a poor manager, that wealth would be squandered, and the family's status would decline. Astrid walking through the smoky longhouse, the bronze keys jingling at her waist, was a figure of real power. Her place on the social ladder was not below her husband's, but parallel to it. A different kind of authority that was just as essential to their world. Number 16, you could be a warrior without raiding. Sigurd was a Huskarl. He lived around the year 1050 in the household of a powerful Danish Jarl. He was a professional warrior, a member of the Jarl's personal retinue. His name, Huskarl, literally meant houseman. His primary loyalty was not to a king or a country, but to the lord whose bread he ate and whose ale he drank. Unlike the common farmer, the carl who had to leave his fields to go to war, fighting was Sigurd's full-time occupation. He was handpicked by the Jarl for his skill, strength, and loyalty. In return for his service, the Jarl provided him with food, lodging in the longhouse, and high-quality weapons and armor. He wore a mail shirt, a conical helmet with a nose guard, and carried a large round shield. His primary weapon was the Great Danish Axe, a fearsome weapon that could cleave through a helmet or a shield with a single blow. The relationship between the Jarl and his Huskarls was deeply personal. It was based on the gift-giving cycle. At feasts, the Jarl would publicly reward his warriors for their bravery and service. He would give them silver arm rings, fine weapons, or gold. These were not just payments, they were symbols of the bond between them. By accepting the gift, the Huskarl pledged his life to his lord. He was expected to stand by his lord in a shield wall, to fight to the death to protect him. The sagas are full of stories of Huskarls who died defending their chieftain. To flee a battle while your lord was still fighting was the ultimate shame. The Huskarls were an elite force. They were the Jarl's bodyguards, his enforcers, and the hardcore of his army. When the Jarl went raiding, they formed the prow of his ship. When he held court, they stood guard, their weapons a clear display of his power. Their social status was high. They were above the common farmers, they were respected for their martial prowess and their unwavering loyalty. But their position was also precarious. It depended entirely on the fortunes of their lord. If their Jarl was killed or lost his power, his Huskarls would be scattered, forced to seek a new master. Sigurd's place on the ladder was high, but it was tied directly to the man he served. He was a powerful and respected figure, but he was not his own man. Number 15, land was the only real power. Leif was a carl, a free farmer in the Malaren Valley of Sweden in the early 10th century. The proper term for him was bondi, which means own who is settled or own who has a household. This was the core of his identity. Leif owned his farm, his odel. It was not a huge estate like a Jarl's, but it was his. His family had worked this land for generations. The Burial mounds of his ancestors stood on a nearby hill. This ownership of land was the foundation of his freedom and his status. It made him a member of the community with a voice. Because he owned land, he had the right and the obligation to attend the local thing. There, among the other landowners, he could speak on matters of law, settle disputes with his neighbors, and witness agreements. His word had weight. He was a full member of society. His farm was his kingdom. It supported his family, his elderly parents, a few farmhands, and a couple of thralls. He had a duty to defend it. By law, a free farmer was expected to own weapons, a shield, a spear, and an axe, or a sword. If the local jarl called the levy, the Landowners, Leif was expected to join the fleet for a certain period each summer. He was a farmer first, but he was also a part of the region's military strength. His status was not just about rights, it was about responsibilities. The land defined him, it connected him to his past and his future. He would pass the farm on to his son, just as his father had passed it to him. Selling the ancestral land, the odel, was a deeply shameful act, something done only in the most dire circumstances. You know, it was like selling a piece of your family's soul. A landless free man was in a much weaker position. He might work as a tenant farmer for a wealthy landowner or hire himself out as a laborer. He had more rights than a thrall, but he lacked the independence and the political voice of the Bondi. He was dependent on others for his livelihood. Leif, looking out over his fields of barley, his cattle grazing by the river, knew his place in the world. He was not at the top of the ladder, but his feet were planted on the most solid rung of all the land. It was the source of his food, his freedom, and his honor. Number 14, a jarl's main job was giving things away. Halfdan was a jarl in Rogaland, Norway, around the year 880. His power did not come from a crown or a government appointment. It came from the personal loyalty of the free farmers and warriors who followed him, and he maintained that loyalty through a constant, calculated display of generosity. Halfdan was a ring giver, a common kenning for a lord in skaldic poetry. It was his most important role. The Great Longhouse was the center of his power. In the winter, when the ships were beached and the farming was done, Halfdan would host magnificent feasts. He would invite all the important farmers and warriors from the surrounding region. The Longhouse would be filled with people. The fires would blaze. Huge quantities of roast meat and fish would be served. Ale and mead would flow freely. This was the first part of his job, providing for his followers, showing them that he was a man of wealth and substance. The highlight of the feast was the gift-giving. After the meal, Halfdan would sit on his high seat. His finest warriors, his huskarls, would be called forward one by one. For a warrior who had shown great bravery in the last raid, Halfdan might give a sword with a silver inlaid hilt. For another, a finely made helmet. For all of them, he would give arm rings of silver or gold, often hacking pieces off a larger spiral of metal right there in the hall. These were not just trinkets, they were public declarations of the bond between the Jarl and his man. They were a reward for past loyalty and an insurance policy for future service. The farmers who supported him also received gifts, perhaps a fine new plowshare, a good milk cow, or a favorable loan of seed grain. This generosity created a web of obligation. A man who accepted a gift from a Jarl was bound to support him in return, with his sword, his crops, or his vote at the thing. This system was a precarious balancing act. To give away wealth, a Jarl needed to acquire it. This meant successful raids, profitable trade, and productive farms. If a Jarl's raids failed, if his ships were lost, if his harvests were poor, his ability to give gifts would dry up. And if the gifts stopped, the loyalty of his followers would wither. They would drift away to a more successful, more generous chieftain. Halfdan's position at the top of the local ladder was not secure. It had to be constantly reinforced, feast by feast, gift by gift. Number 13, your foster brother was closer than your blood brother. In the year 995, in Iceland, a man named Jartan was the son of a powerful chieftain. His best friend was Bali. They grew up together on the same farm. They were foster brothers, fostbræður. This was not an informal friendship. Fosterage was a formal social institution, a way to build alliances and strengthen ties between families. A chieftain would often send his son to be raised in the household of another powerful man. The bond between foster brothers was considered one of the strongest and most sacred in Viking society. In many ways, it was held to be even stronger than the bond between blood brothers. A man's brother was his by accident of birth. His foster brother was his by choice, by a deliberate act of alliance building between their families. They learned to fight together, to ride together, to face the world together. They shared the same food, the same teachers, the same home. They owed each other absolute loyalty. Kjartan and Bolli were inseparable. The Laxdæla saga, which tells their story, describes their deep affection and loyalty. But their bond was put to the ultimate test over a woman, Gudrun. Both men loved her. While Kjartan was away in Norway, Bolli was tricked into marrying her. When Kjartan returned, the friendship was shattered. The conflict that followed tore the region apart. The tragedy of their story lies in the violation of the foster brother bond. Their duty to each other should have outweighed everything else. Bolli's betrayal of Kjartan and Kjartan's subsequent actions led to a violent blood feud that resulted in both their deaths. The saga presents this as a profound tragedy, a failure of the most important social bond a man could have. The institution of fosterage was a key part of the social glue. It created kinship where there was none. It turned potential rivals into allies. A Jarl who had fostered the sons of other powerful men could count on their support in times of war. It was a strategic investment in the future. The story of Kjartan and Bolli is a cautionary tale famous in the Icelandic world about how the breaking of that sacred trust could lead to ruin. It shows that kinship, and therefore status and security, could be manufactured. It was not just about blood. Number 12. Becoming a king meant breaking the rules. For much of the Viking Age, Scandinavia was not made up of unified kingdoms like England or Francia. It was a patchwork of territories controlled by local chieftains or jarls. A king or konungur was often just the most successful jarl in a region. The difference between a jarl and a king was one of degree. A king had a larger territory and commanded the loyalty of other lesser jarls. The path to kingship was not through orderly succession. It was through ambition, violence, and political maneuvering. A man did not inherit a kingdom so much as he created it. Consider the story of Harald Fairhair, who is traditionally credited with unifying Norway around the year 872. He was originally the jarl of a small region in the south. According to the sagas, he made a vow not to cut or comb his hair until he was the sole king of all of Norway. His method was straightforward. He used the wealth and manpower from his own lands to build a powerful army and a fleet of longships. Then he went to the neighboring jarls with a simple offer: submit to his rule and become his vassals, or be defeated in battle and have their lands taken by force. Many chose to fight. Harald crushed them in a series of brutal campaigns, culminating in the great naval battle of Hafrsfjord. Once he had defeated his rivals, Harald consolidated his power. He placed his own loyal jarls in charge of the conquered territories. He established a system of taxation, demanding tribute from all the lands under his control. This gave him a steady stream of income, allowing him to maintain a large body of professional warriors, his huskarls, and reward his followers. He was breaking the old system of independent chieftains and creating a new, centralized power structure with himself at the top. This process was repeated across Scandinavia. Men like Gorm the Old in Denmark and Eric the Victorious in Sweden used similar methods to forge larger kingdoms. They were essentially gangster kings, using force to eliminate rivals and extract wealth. Their success created a new higher rung on the social ladder, the national king, a man who stood above even the most powerful jarls. But it was a position won and held by the sword. Number 11, exile was a form of social death. Grettir the Strong was one of the most famous figures in the Icelandic sagas. He was a man of incredible strength and bravery, but he also had a hot temper and a talent for making enemies. Around the year 1016, after a series of killings and disputes, he was brought before the Althing. The verdict was the harshest punishment possible, short of immediate execution. Grettir was declared an outlaw, an utlagi. This was not simply banishment. Outlawry was a complete removal from the protection of society. An outlaw was declared a wolf in sacred places. Any man could kill him without penalty. In fact, killing a famous outlaw could bring a man honor. No one was allowed to give him food, shelter, or aid of any kind. To help an outlaw was to risk being outlawed yourself. His property was confiscated, his marriage was dissolved, he was legally dead. For Grettir, this meant a life on the run. He lived in caves and remote huts in the Icelandic highlands, a barren and unforgiving landscape. He survived by stealing sheep from farmers and fishing in secret. He was constantly hunted by bounty hunters and the families of the men he had killed. The saga tells of his incredible 20 years as an outlaw, a record. He was lonely, miserable, and paranoid. He was terrified of the dark, a psychological consequence of his constant isolation and fear. The story of Grettir illustrates the immense power of the community. In a world with no police force or central government, the threat of exclusion was the ultimate tool for maintaining order. To be part of the community was to have a place on the ladder, to be protected by the law and the web of kinship. To be cast out was to have your rung on the ladder sawed off. You were no longer part of the structure. You were nothing. Outlawry could be for a fixed term, typically 3 years for lesser offenses. This was known as lesser outlawry or fjordagsgarður. The person had to leave Iceland for that period. Full outlawry, skoganger, was a life sentence. Grettir's long, lonely struggle against society and his eventual death at the hands of his enemies served as a powerful lesson for everyone else. The society you belonged to was everything. To be outside, it was to be less than human. Number 10, going abroad could be a shortcut up the ladder. Halldór was a young man from a modest farming family in Iceland in the early 11th century. He was strong and ambitious, but he had no land of his own and few prospects. Staying in Iceland, he would likely remain a landless farmhand for the rest of his life, a low rung on the Karl ladder. So he chose a path taken by many adventurous young Norsemen. He traveled to Constantinople, which they called Miklagard, the great city, to join the Varangian Guard. The Varangian Guard was an elite unit of the Byzantine Emperor's personal bodyguards, composed almost entirely of Scandinavians. And they were famous for their height, their fierce loyalty to the man who paid them at least, and their great axes. To be accepted into the Guard was difficult. A man had to be strong, skilled in combat, and preferably bring his own weapons and armor. For Halldór, life in the Guard was a world away from the farm. He was paid a handsome salary in gold coin. He was quartered in the imperial palace. He took part in brutal military campaigns in Sicily and the Balkans. But the real prize was the looting. When an emperor died, the Varangians had the traditional right to run to the imperial treasury and take as much gold and valuables as they could carry. This was a legal part of their payment. After 10 years of service, Halldór decided to return home. He was no longer a poor farm boy. He was a wealthy man. He traveled back to Iceland with chests of gold, silk, and other treasures. He arrived dressed in fine Byzantine clothes, a man of the world. With his newfound wealth, he bought a large farm, one of the best in his district. He married the daughter of a chieftain, a match that would have been impossible for him a decade earlier. Halldór's story shows a unique path of social mobility. By leaving the rigid social structure of his homeland, he was able to acquire immense wealth and return as a big man. He had effectively used foreign service as a shortcut to the top. The sagas are full of Varangians who return home rich and influential. This option, open to any free man with enough courage and luck, acted as a kind of safety valve. It gave ambitious but low-status men a way to dramatically improve their standing, proving that the rungs of the ladder could sometimes be skipped, if you were willing to travel far enough and risk everything. Number 9. Your clothes told everyone your rank. In the market at Hedeby, a bustling trade center in southern Denmark around 970, A person's social standing could be read at a glance, just from their clothing. A thrall, a slave like the woman unloading sacks from a boat, wore a simple, undyed tunic of coarse wool known as wadmal. It was rough, functional, and cheap. It marked her instantly as belonging to the lowest class. A free farmer, a carl, standing nearby bargaining for iron tools, was dressed more substantially. He wore a tunic of dyed wool, perhaps a simple brown or green made from better quality cloth. Over it he might have a woolen cloak, fastened at the shoulder with a simple bronze or iron pin. His trousers were likely close-fitting. His clothes were practical for work, but the fact that they were dyed and better made showed he was a man of some means. He was a freeman, part of the solid middle of society. Then a Jarl's wife walked through the market, accompanied by her attendants. Her status was unmistakable. Her dress was not just wool, but fine, smooth wool, possibly imported from England. It was dyed a vibrant color, perhaps a rich red or a deep blue. Dyes were expensive. Red dye from the madder root and blue from woad required significant effort to produce, making the cloth a luxury item. Her dress might be trimmed with silk, a fantastically expensive material brought all the way from the Byzantine Empire or Central Asia. She wore a magnificent oval brooch of gilded bronze on each shoulder to hold up her overdress, with strings of glass beads and silver pendants hanging between them. Her cloak was trimmed with fur. The Jarl himself would be similarly impressive. His tunic might be of fine blue wool, decorated with embroidered silk cuffs. His cloak, fastened with a heavy silver brooch, showed his wealth and his ability to command the work of skilled artisans. These clothes were not just for warmth. They were a broadcast of status, the quality of the material, the brilliance of the color, the amount of ornamentation. All of it sent a clear signal about a person's place in the hierarchy. You didn't need to ask someone their rank. You could see it in the threads they wore. Number 8, a seeress stood outside the ladder. It was a hard winter in Greenland around the year 1000. The settlement was on the brink of famine, the hunts had failed, and the people were desperate. In this time of crisis, the community turned to a woman named Thorbjorg. She was a vulva, a seeress, a practitioner of the magic art known as cider. Her social position was completely unique. She did not fit on the normal ladder of Thrall, Carl, and Jarl. And Thorbjorg, described in the saga of Eric the Red, was an old woman who traveled from farm to farm, predicting the future and performing rituals. When she arrived at the farm where the community was gathered, she was treated with extreme reverence. She was given a high seat to sit on, cushioned with hen feathers. She was served a special meal prepared only for her, of goat's milk porridge and the hearts of all the different kinds of animals available. Her appearance was as striking as her role. She wore a blue cloak adorned with stones. She had a necklace of glass beads. On her head, she wore a hood of black lambskin lined with white catskin. She carried a staff, a symbol of her power, decorated with brass. At her belt hung a pouch containing the charms and tools of her trade. To perform her ritual, she needed a choir of women to sing a specific chant. Once the song was sung, Thorbjorg entered a trance. She spoke to the spirits. When she came out of the trance, she gave her prophecy. The famine would end, she said, and the fortunes of the settlement would improve. Her words gave the people hope. For her services, she was well paid. A vulva was both respected and feared. Her connection to the supernatural world placed her outside the normal social order. She wielded a different kind of power, not based on land or wealth, but on knowledge and magic. Even the most powerful chieftain would treat her with caution and respect. Well, her prophecy could bring him good fortune, but her curse could bring ruin. Her place was not on any single rung of the social ladder. Instead, she stood beside it, able to influence the fortunes of everyone on it, from the lowest thrall to the highest jarl. Number 7, hospitality was a weapon. In the year 985, a chieftain in Iceland named Rathminkel held a great feast. He had just returned from a successful summer of fishing and trading. His storehouses were full. It was time to reinforce his social standing. Hospitality was not just about being friendly, it was a critical part of the power structure. A man's honor and influence were directly measured by his ability to host guests lavishly. Hrathkel invited all the important farmers from his region. When they arrived at his longhouse, he greeted them personally at the door. Their horses were taken and cared for. Inside, the longhouse was clean, the fires were lit, and the benches were covered with fresh straw and furs. This immediate show of welcome and comfort was the first step. The feast itself was a display of wealth. There was boiled horse meat, a delicacy. There was fresh fish, roasted birds and skyr, a thick yogurt like cheese. Most importantly, there was an endless supply of strong ale. To run out of food or drink would be a profound dishonor for the host. As the men ate and drank, Hrathpinkel moved among them, talking, laughing, making sure everyone felt welcome. This was more than a party. It was a political event. By providing this bounty, Hrathpinkel was reminding everyone of his success and his wealth. He was placing his guests in his debt. A man who had eaten a chieftain's food and drunk his ale was subtly obligated to him. He would be more likely to support Hrathpinkel at the Thing, or to join him if he called for men to fight. Conversely, a lack of hospitality was a grave insult. To be turned away from a farm at night or to be offered a meager meal was a sign of disrespect. Such slights could lead to lasting enmity and even violence. The sagas contain many stories where a failure of hospitality is the spark that ignites a blood feud. And Hrathkel's feast was a success. His guests left full, drunk, and impressed. His reputation as a powerful and generous leader was secure. He had used his food and his ale not just to feed his friends, but to build and maintain his position on the social ladder. Hospitality was a currency, and a well-hosted feast was an investment in power. Number 6. Your name was your family's reputation. A boy born around the year 900 was not just given a personal name like Olaf or Eric. He was Olaf, son of Bjorn, or Eric, son of Svein. The patronymic system adding son or daughter for a daughter to the father's name was the standard. This meant a person's name was an immediate link to their lineage. Your name announced who your father was, and by extension, your family status. If your father was a famous Jarl, your name carried weight from the moment you were born. People knew your family. They knew its history, its wealth, its allies, and its enemies. You inherited not just property, but reputation. This could be a great advantage, opening doors and commanding respect, but it could also be a burden. You were expected to live up to the name. If your father was a great warrior, you were expected to be brave. If he was known for his wisdom, you were expected to be clever. This emphasis on lineage made the social ladder quite rigid. It was difficult for a man from a poor, unknown family to rise to a high position. The great families, the Jarls and chieftains, tended to intermarry, consolidating their power and wealth. Their names became a kind of brand, a mark of quality in the social marketplace. However, a name could also be made. A man who achieved great things on his own could acquire a nickname that became a part of his identity. Eric the Red was named for his red hair and beard, but also, perhaps, for his fiery temper. Ivar the Boneless was a famously cunning and agile warrior. Sigurd's snake in the eye was said to have been born with a mark in his eye resembling a serpent. These nicknames were earned and they added to a person's fame. They became part of the story told about a man, a personal addition to the inherited reputation of his family name. The name of a thrall was different. A thrall often had a simple short name and no patronymic. They were just Cole or Thora. Their name deliberately disconnected them from any lineage. They had no family in a legal sense. They were rootless. This stark difference in naming conventions was a constant, everyday reminder of the social chasm between the free and the unfree. Your name was your place in the world, a direct statement of which rung you stood on. Number 5, justice was a do-it-yourself project. Around the year 960, a farmer in Norway named Gunnar found that his neighbor Ketil had moved the boundary stones between their fields, stealing a strip of valuable pasture land. Today, Gunnar would call the police or sue Ketil in court, but in the Viking Age, the concept of public law enforcement did not exist. There was no police force to investigate the crime and no state prosecutor to bring a case. Justice was a private matter. Gunnar's first step was to seek a peaceful solution. He gathered witnesses and went to Ketil, demanding he move the stones back and pay a fine for the theft. This was the preferred outcome. The legal system was designed to facilitate negotiation and settlement to avoid violence. Ketil, being a stubborn man, refused. Now Gunnar had to escalate. His next step was to take the case to the local thing, the Assembly of Free Men. He would stand before the assembly and formally accuse Ketil. Both men would present their cases. They would bring witnesses. Their reputations mattered. A man with a good reputation and powerful friends was more likely to be believed. The assembly would then act as a jury and deliver a verdict. If they found Ketil guilty, they would declare the fine he had to pay. But the thing had no power to enforce its own verdict. If Ketil still refused to pay, Gunnar had one final option in the feud. He had the legal right, backed by the thing's verdict, to take matters into his own hands. He could go to Ketil's farm and seize property equal to the value of the fine. This was a dangerous step. It could easily erupt into a full-blown blood feud between the two families, a cycle of revenge killings that could last for generations. This system placed a huge burden on the individual. A man's ability to get justice depended on his own resources, his reputation, and the number of friends and relatives he could count on to back him up. A poor man with few connections would have a very difficult time bringing a case against a powerful Jarl. The social ladder was not just a measure of wealth, but of a person's ability to enforce their rights. Justice was not given by the state. It was something you had to be strong enough to take for yourself. Number 4, the thing was the center of the world. Every spring, a man named Ulf, a farmer from the west of Iceland, would prepare for a journey. He was not going raiding or trading. He was going to the Althing. For Ulf and thousands of others, this annual gathering at Thingvellir was the most important event of the year. It was the glue that held their scattered independent society together. The Thing was not just a parliament or a court. It was a national festival, a trade fair, and a social gathering all in one. For the 2 weeks of the assembly, the barren lava plain was transformed into a temporary city of turf and stone booths. Those families would set up camp, marriages were arranged, news and gossip from distant parts of the country were exchanged, merchants sold their wares, poets and storytellers performed, the official business was serious, the law speaker recited the law. The courts heard cases ranging from land disputes to accusations of manslaughter. Chieftains, the Godar, met to make new laws and debate policy. Ulf, as a free landowner, had a role to play. He was required to attend or send a representative. He was a part of his chieftain's delegation. He might be called to sit on a panel to judge a case. His presence and his voice mattered. The Thing was the practical application of his status as a free man. One year, Ulf's cousin was involved in a complex inheritance case. The entire family traveled to the Althing to support him. It was a show of strength and solidarity. Their numbers, their presence, sent a message to the opposing family. At the Thing, a man was not just an individual, he was a representative of his kin. The outcome of a legal case could depend as much on the number of armed relatives a man brought with him as on the fine points of the law. For Ulf, the journey to the Thing reaffirmed his place in the world. It connected him to the wider community, reminded him of his rights and responsibilities, and allowed him to participate directly in the governance of his country. It was where the social ladder was most visible, with chieftains politicking in their booths, while farmers debated law and thralls tended the horses. It was the stage on which the drama of their society played out. Number 3. Honor was more valuable than silver. In the year 1010, at a feast in the Orkney Islands, a Jarl named Sigurd was holding court. A visiting Icelandic poet, known for his sharp tongue, made a slightly mocking comment about the quality of the Jarl's ale. It was a minor slight, but in the honor-based culture of the Vikings, it was a public challenge to the Jarl's reputation, his hider. His honor was the single most important social currency. It was a combination of a person's reputation, their public image, and their self-respect. It was built up over a lifetime through acts of bravery, generosity, and keeping one's word. A man with great honor was respected and influential. A man who lost his honor was shamed, and his social standing would plummet. Sigurd could not let the insult pass. To do so would show weakness. It would suggest that he was a man whose reputation could be attacked without consequence. He did not fly into a rage. Instead, he calmly replied with a challenge. He wagered his own honor against the poet's that his warriors could defeat any challenge the poet could name. The matter was now a formal contest. The small insult had been escalated into a public test of the Jarl's power and his men's skill. The next day, a series of contests were held. The Jarl's men won. The poet had to publicly admit that the Jarl was a great leader and his men were superior. The Jarl's honor was not just restored, it was enhanced. He had successfully defended his reputation. He might even reward the poet for providing him with the opportunity to display his men's prowess. This constant negotiation of honor dictated much of Viking social interaction. A man had to be vigilant in protecting his and his family's reputation. An insult required a response. A broken oath was a source of deep shame. A failure to avenge a slain kinsman was a stain on the family's honor. This is why blood feuds were so common and so difficult to end. They were not just about revenge, they were about restoring the family's honor in the eyes of the community. A man's position on the social ladder was not just determined by his wealth or his title. It was determined by the weight of his honor, a commodity that was hard to win and easy to lose. Number 2, the gods cared about your actions, not your beliefs. A farmer named Sten lived near Uppsala in Sweden in the late 10th century. He was a devout man. He made regular offerings to Thor for strength and to Frey for a good harvest. He wore a small silver hammer amulet around his neck. But his religion was not a matter of private faith or internal belief in the modern sense. It was a practical transactional relationship with the gods, deeply intertwined with his social life. The Norse religion, often called paganism, did not have a central holy book or a professional priesthood telling people what to believe. Priests and priestesses existed, but their role was to lead public rituals. The head of a household, the bondi, was the priest for his own family. It was Sten's job to lead the rituals at his farm, to make the offerings, and to maintain a good relationship with the local gods and land spirits. The most important religious events were public festivals like the Great Sacrifice at Uppsala, held every 9 years, or the seasonal Blotts sacrifices that marked the turning of the year. These were community events. Sten would travel to the local gathering place with his neighbors. They would sacrifice animals, feast on the meat, and drink ale that had been blessed. This was not about quiet prayer. It was about shared action. Participating in these rituals was a key part of being a member of the community. It showed you were one of them, that you honored the same traditions and the same gods that protected the community. The gods were powerful, but they were not seen as morally perfect beings who demanded adherence to a strict ethical code. They were more like powerful chieftains. You gave them gift sacrifices to win their favor and get things in return: a safe voyage, victory in battle, a healthy child. It was a contract. If you upheld your end, you expected them to uphold theirs. This practical approach to religion meant that a person's social standing and their religious practice were linked. A powerful Jarl would sponsor a large, impressive blot to demonstrate his wealth and piety, further enhancing his status. A poor farmer might only be able to offer a chicken. The act of participating was what mattered. It was a social duty. Your actions, your sacrifices, your participation in the public rites, these were what defined your religious identity and reinforced your place within the social fabric. Number 1, society was a web, not a ladder. It is easy to think of Viking society as a simple 3-tiered ladder: Thralls at the bottom, Carls in the middle, and Jarls at the top. But the reality, as seen through the lives of all these people, was far more complex. It was less like a rigid ladder and more like an intricate web of relationships and obligation. Consider a Jarl. He was at the top, but he was not an absolute ruler. His power depended entirely on the loyalty of the free farmers, the carls, who supported him. He was bound to them by the obligation to be generous, to lead them successfully in war, and to uphold the law at the thing. If he failed in these duties, his support would vanish. A carl, the free farmer, was the central knot in the web. He was a landowner, a warrior, a father, and a participant in the legal system. He owed loyalty upwards to his jarl, but he also had obligations to his own kin. He was part of a network of relatives who were honor-bound to support and avenge each other. His status depended on his land, his honor, and the strength of his family network. Even a thrall, while legally property, was part of this web. A skilled thrall might be a valued member of a household. A master who was too cruel to his thralls might gain a bad reputation, which could damage his social standing. The possibility of being freed, becoming a Leysingi, created another complex link, tying the freedman to his former master's family for generations. Then there were the specialists who had their own unique places in the web, the skald, whose words could build or destroy reputation, the law speaker, whose knowledge was the bedrock of the legal system, the vulva, whose connection to the supernatural gave her a different kind of authority, the merchant, whose new wealth was challenging the old, land-based order, the huskarl, whose professional loyalty to his lord was a powerful, specialized bond. Every individual was tied to others through multiple threads: kinship, loyalty to a leader, fosterage, marriage alliances, shared religious practice, and economic necessity. A person's true position in society was defined by the number and strength of these threads. A man with many powerful relatives, a good lord, and a strong reputation was secure. A man with few connections was vulnerable, no matter how much land he owned. This web was the real secret of the Viking social structure. It was a dynamic, interconnected system where everyone, from the Jarl in his high seat to the thrall in the fields, was bound to everyone else.